Dragon Silver, Wizard Gold. Book 1 in the Varthien Saga by Kris Sihto. Chapter 5. The Summons. 661 OM Tarandir. Year of the Tangled Briar. Norman's Tower. Norman's sleep had been rudely interrupted by an all-too-familiar voice directly in his ear. "You're needed, boy!" it shouted at him, causing him to violently jerk awake, falling off the bed and onto the raw wooden floor of his third-floor laboratory space. A slow sizzle filled the room, hot and hissing, and a yellow glow emanated from the pedestal, routinely used for isolating volatile items he was handling at any particular time. Grabbing a stick of chalk, he drew a quick retardant perimeter to halt the spread of any spontaneous floor combustion. Then he stepped forward, one steady step at a time, trying to ignore the sweat that had newly formed on his forehead and was now trickling into his eyes. Within the glow was a small yellow flame, and within that flame he witnessed a thing he had never dared imagine. A golden ring was building itself in the heart of the flame. He considered it closely. Fast teleport he was familiar with, but this seemed to be a slow teleport, potentially atoms at a time. The heat, he surmised, was probably a result of friction, as atoms were suddenly shifted to make way for the new matter. Norman took a deep breath in, filling his lungs, then let it slowly, taking a moment to think. Then he quietly pulled some emergency items together, floating them silently towards him from areas around the tower. "Susie," he said to the gargoyle he knew was sitting in the rafters, "sorry to put this on you, but I need to head out rather suddenly. Could you please look after Peter while I'm gone? Who knows what he'll get up to without me? If he asks, tell him I'm taking care of something important, and I'll make sure I'm back before his birthday. And it's okay to have a lick, but don't eat the entire teleport when I leave. I want to study it later to see how it works. I'll get you something nice instead when I get back. Thank you." Bracing himself for the potential of mutilation or horrendous agony, he poked a calloused finger at the tiny piece of gold and was suddenly somewhere else. His muscles clenched as bare feet reacted to the transition from warm wood to cold stone, and he started to shiver. This place was far darker than the room he had been in, and spots formed in front of his eyes as he strained to see. But slowly he started to make put a pile of clothing lying only a few paces away, and then suddenly he could see that this pile wasn't simply clothing. There was a person lying crumpled on the floor. "Albert!" Norman rushed to the side of the collapsed man. The steady rise and fall of Albert's chest reassured him that his mentor and friend still lived, although at this distance he could hear that the man's breathing rattled and wheezed. With gentleness, he snuck his arms under Albert's shoulders and knees, lifting him from the cold floor. The realization that his once teacher was now so light and frail was shocking to him, and he did his best to not jostle the elderly mage as he carried him to the small cot set against the wall. Things in Albert's hall were much as they had been decades ago when Norman had spent his younger years here. He remembered this space, sunk into the side of a mountain, the walls smoothed as if someone had melted them into glass. Pots of glisterweed along the walls or on the frequent shelving that jutted directly from the stone lit the space with a soft orange light. Each room was neat and ordered, with none of the clutter that Norman preferred to surround himself with. He put the same old kettle onto the familiar hob, then reached for the white-glazed pottery canister for the tea that sat in its habitual spot. How had it survived all this time, he wondered, as it must have already been old when he was just a boy. Nostalgia burned hot, unshed tears in the corners of his eyes as he worried about the mage in the next room. Norman looked down at himself, realizing that he was here only in a night frock. That would make things difficult, he considered, as his bladder started to press upon his needs. The thing with digging a home into the side of a mountain is that some mountains are in inconvenient places. Albert's mountain was in a very inconvenient place, and the coolness of this room was nothing compared to the icy wasteland he would have to traverse to reach the outhouse which was, inconveniently, outside. He sighed and moved towards the annex, a group of rooms Albert had dug specifically for Norman's apprenticeship, and which he assumed had been repurposed for additional storage or other apprentices. Passing through the doorway, he moved automatically across to his wardrobe and pulled out an old favoured cloak. And he halted. Scanning across the room, a pair of shoes was nestled beneath the bed. A scatter of things, odd socks, random bits of paper, a broken-nibbed quill, lay strewn on the rumpled bedspread. A few old journals slumped sideways on shelving. The desk by the bed housed a wide but shallow wooden box with a lattice framework inside, each section painstakingly inked with a description of the powders that had once filled it. Norman ran his fingers over the smooth wood. Barring a thin layer of dust, it was just as he had left it on his 18th birthday. The shoes would be handy, he thought, and socks, no matter how odd. Then, with a sudden spurt of memory, he fell to his knees and reached under the bed. Yes, it was still here, the open crate that had been the final resting place for his outdoor clothing. Swiftly he pulled on his full fleece, pants, coat, hat, and finally the wool-lined boots, and braved the path to the snowy outdoors. By the time he returned, the kettle had just started to whistle, and he gratefully poured the steaming liquid into the 2 cups with dried leaves in the bottom. A little honey into both, and he carefully carried them back into the workshop where he had left Albert. He pulled a chair and a small table over to the small cot, which had never been intended as a permanent bed. It was here for those days when the work was too taxing, and the walk back to the bedroom was too far. "Boy," the elderly man croaked, "what took you so long? I've been waiting." Norman sighed with relief, a smile flitting across his face at his mentor's consciousness. "I got here as quickly as I could. I have tea if you're able." Norman propped Albert up to sip at the sweet tea. Feeling the sharp bones of Albert's spine pressing into his shoulder, he shifted, placing the bulk of his body behind the man's back to give him some stability. "I'll get you into your bedroom once you feel strong enough to walk. You seemed to be in quite a state when I arrived." Albert heaved a breath, followed by a rattling cough that shook his frail body. Panting from the exertion, he squeezed out, "Just a moment or two and I'll be right," but a hand would not go amiss.